Good morning, friends. One of the things we talked about this past Sunday was the fact that we are all saved by the same grace. And this is important because we were talking about the wicked and how God deals with the wicked. And the two ways we saw that God deals with the wicked is that he either saves them out of their wickedness or he allows them to remain in their wickedness, which means that God either becomes the refuge of the wicked or he becomes the destruction of the wicked. He becomes the refuge of those whom he saves out of the wickedness, and for any whom he leaves in their wickedness, which they are happy to do, they want to be in their wickedness, and so he just leaves them in that desire. Well, since they do not want him to be their refuge, he does become their destruction. And coming out of all of this, then, is the realization that everyone originally belongs to that category of the wicked. These are the only two options for any of us. We either take refuge in God through faith in Christ and so are saved out of that wickedness, or we remain in our wickedness and so face the just condemnation for it. But again, this means that we must be willing to admit that yes, if it weren't for the grace of God, we ourselves would still be firmly in that category of the wicked. And that can be a hard thing for some people to admit at times, especially if they have a more or less moralistic outlook on life. They know that they're not perfect. You know, you have to be very prideful and arrogant to think that you are perfect. Everybody's willing to admit that they do have sin, but at the same time, you're not that bad, right? I mean, it's not hard at all to find people that are worse than you. And really, when it comes right down to it, those people are the wicked ones, right? Hitler and Stalin and Saddam Hussein and terrorists and murderers and rapists and pedophiles and such. Those are the real wicked people, or so the thought goes. And in truth, those people are wicked people. The problem isn't with designating them as wicked. The problem is when we put them off in their own category called the wicked, and we act as if we don't also belong to that category, because we do. At least prior to Christ's work in us, we did. And therefore, we needed the grace of God just as much as they do. Now, the question is raised in light of all this, at least in terms of me making this claim, the question comes up, well, how in the world can you put a person who has never murdered anyone, never committed an act of terror, never assaulted or molested anyone, how could you possibly put them in the same category as those who have done those things? How can you say that everyone is wicked? Well, it all comes down to the moral standard by which we must all be judged, who set that standard, and our own relationship to that standard. Because the standard by which we must be judged is not something of our own creation. The standard is God's standard, his creation, if you will. For one, that means that it's an objective standard, something outside of ourselves that we cannot change, simply because we want it to be changed or diminished or skewed to give us a favorable position in relationship to it. But for another thing, since it is God's standard, then it is based on who he is, on his nature and his will, which of course are all perfect, which helps us to understand our standing in relationship to that standard. Because if we are willing to admit that we aren't perfect, that we have sinned in any way whatsoever, then the only conclusion we can come to is that we have failed to obey. Or to state it more accurately, more pointedly, we have disobeyed God's law, his commands. And that, in and of itself, right there, puts us in the category of the wicked. Because to disobey, to rebel against God's law, is to commit wickedness. You see, we struggle with this idea because in our culture, in the way that we as sinful human beings use words like wicked, well, we do so, and have done so in a bunch of different ways over the years, in a way to minimize the impact and the reality of what these words point to, what the word wicked points to. You know, for two quick things: either we mock the very idea of wickedness by simply changing its definition in our common usage, or we make it such an overblown idea that people still don't take it seriously, even though it still refers to something that's indeed evil. A quick example for each. We mock the idea of wickedness and the reality of what it is when the word itself becomes slang for something cool or impressive, something that is wicked good. Okay. On the other side of things, we set up the villains in our entertainment as being wicked. This may seem like a silly example, but it's an obvious one. like the Wicked Witch of the West from The Wizard of Oz. Which, and doing that kind of thing actually associates the idea of wickedness with something that is so over the top that a separation is created between the concept of wickedness and ordinary people like us, such that we could never have the term applied to us. And actually, funnily enough, but pointedly enough, I was having a little bit of paranoia there. Like, it was the Wicked Witch of the West, right? Not the Wicked Witch of the East, in the Wizard of Oz that is the main villain. And so I Googled it just to make sure. And the Google description came up of the Wicked Witch of the West, and it included this line: "The Wicked Witch of the West represents pure evil of the sort usually only found in fairy tales." Friends, I didn't write that. That was wherever the Google summary came from. But that points to exactly what I'm talking about. That the term wicked is applied to someone who is only in the fairy tales. Because in the way we would like to think about things, actual wicked people don't exist in the real world. The wicked are just those thoroughly and irredeemably evil people that are mostly only seen in those archaic and increasingly irrelevant fairy tales, those morality tales that we don't pay much attention to anymore. But no, the truth is that wickedness is a real thing here in the real world. And it's something that we all have within us. Because the definition of wickedness is not based off of what the Wicked Witch of the West looks like or whatever other idea we might have. The definition of wickedness is based off of God's standard of right and wrong, and we've all fallen short of that standard. We've all broken His law. We've all engaged in wickedness. Let me give you one more way of looking at this, because Jesus Himself says that all of God's law can be summed up in 2 commands: to love God with everything you have and to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, the murderer, who we would all agree is wicked, that person has broken both those commandments, right? They're certainly not loving God, since they are blatantly breaking God's law and going against the very nature of God Himself in murdering someone. God is the God of life, and they are causing unjust death and so on. That's clear. And they're obviously also not loving their neighbor because they have just murdered their neighbor. That is a hateful act, of course. So we say, yes, this person is wicked. Look at what they've done. But then let's think about our own situation. Have you ever broken God's law? Sure you have. So have I, in a variety of ways, on many occasions. And here's the thing. It doesn't really even matter the way in which we've broken God's law, because the point is simply this. If we break God's law, then we're not loving God the way we're commanded to love Him. We are instead rebelling against God in whatever way it is that we break His law. Now, how about this? Have you ever acted toward another person, a family member, a coworker, whomever it might be, in a less than loving way? Well, if you have, and I know you have, so have I, then you're not keeping a law to love your neighbor either. So, look at what we have done. We have broken the same laws. What really is the difference between us and the people we readily admit are wicked? We're all breaking the same commandments. We're all falling short of the same standard. We're all facing the same penalty for that, which means we all are in need of the exact same grace of God. So, we are allowed to recognize wickedness in this world. And thankfully, due to the grace and the righteousness of God, we no longer do belong to that category. Our identity in Christ is no longer sinner, but saint. No longer the wicked, but the righteous. But we must keep in mind that this transition is not accomplished in our strength, but by the power of and according to the grace of God. And if it had not been for His grace and His work of salvation, we would still be wicked. And so when we think about the wicked, we should be moved to pity for them and thankfulness that by God's grace we were removed from those ranks. And may we be moved, in light of God's grace toward us, to be gracious enough toward them to share the gospel with them in the hopes that perhaps they can become the saints of God, just as we have according to the grace of God. With all this in mind, I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I'll see you soon.